So everybody, I suppose, has now acceded to the recording, and that will now be immortalized on YouTube or wherever this is going to be posted next. So welcome everybody. As you know, this is part of a series of seminars that the Center for Inter-Asian Studies at the University of Ahmedabad and the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand, where I am, we've been organizing starting from last year. And Professor Tejaswini Niranjana and I had this idea of organizing this series of talks on the Indian Ocean, and also to kind of think with a sense of place. So what does it mean to think from the Indian Ocean from Gujarat, for example? And so to think with more expansive geographies from a very local place. So Gujarat, as we've realized over the course of these multiple seminars over the last year and the ongoing ones, is that Gujarat is part of a much larger geography that does not only include South Asia, but includes the east coast of Africa, the expanses of the Indian Ocean, and so on. And we are trying to think through these series about both space and time differently, so that we are handling larger swathes of time, not just 50 years, 100 years, but probably 300 years of oceanic movement, of people, of religion, of trade, and so on and so forth. We're also trying to engage with scholars who are working within multiple disciplines, so that it's not just the archive or the historical archive, either the local ones or the East India Company or the Portuguese or the Dutch that we're looking at. We're also looking at like Nidhi, for example, has done ethnographic work. Jatin Dua has done ethnographic work, exciting ethnographic work with pirates, a large part of it which involved chewing tobacco with them, from what I've read in his book. So it's fairly exciting work that moves out of the archive, goes into the archive and out of it. And so we have moved beyond many of the older themes of trade and civilization, the kind of paradigms that one used to work with. So the series has also brought in a lot of the younger scholars like Nidhi, people like Fahad Bishara, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Kuria, whom we shall be listening to shortly, Samira Sheikh, who have expanded our understanding of what it is to engage with the Indian Ocean. How do we think about its space, its time, the travels, the various themes ranging from religion to ethnography? And in Nidhi's own work, and this particular talk, of course, is on dhows in global shipping, and looking at dhows through the idea of creating value through arbitrage on the Indian Ocean. But her work has dealt with issues of insurance. It has dealt with questions of gender. So when we think about the dhow trade, we tend to see the men out at sea, but there is an entire economy that is sustained by women back home when the dhows aren't able to actually get onto the sea during inclement weather, the monsoons, and so on and so forth. So we look forward to this conversation, Nidhi. And so you have around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we shall take as many questions as there are, and then we'll move on from there. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dilip. And thank you to you and Tejaswini for the invitation. And thank you all for being here today. I'm very excited to share this work. I'm just going to share my screen. I think this should work. Yes?
Yeah, it's working.
Perfect. So the work that I'm sharing with you today is very much a work in progress. And so I'm really looking forward to our conversation afterwards, and looking forward to questions and feedback. And it's fairly recent ethnographic research that I conducted during the pandemic. So again, looking forward to comments, questions, advice, and so on. So the work that I'm sharing with you today is drawn from my book manuscript in progress called Moorings, The Dhow Trade, Capitalism and Sovereignty in the Indian Ocean, which examines how the contemporary Vahan or dhow or wooden sailing vessel trade is embedded in long-standing Indian Ocean forms of exchange that articulate with state sovereignty and global capital today. My talk today will focus on a specific story of a dhow sailor's voyage across the Persian Gulf during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. This latter story will act as a foil for inquiring into a problem that lies at the very heart of my project, namely the entanglement of histories of capital and practices of sovereignty in the Indian Ocean from the perspective of a mobile Indian Ocean Kutchi society of seafarers. At the center of this work is a moving object, sailing vessels from Kutch known as vahans, or in English as dhows. And of course, the British came to use the term dhow to refer to a variety of wooden sailing vessels, typically manned by who they called native crew. These days, however, modern Kutchi vahans are mechanized and continue to traverse old Indian Ocean routes, going where container ships cannot or will not go, functioning as an economy of arbitrage. Vans have especially found a niche in servicing minor ports in times of conflict, such as in Yemen, Somalia, and Iran, becoming what Laleh Khalili has called sinews of war and trade. And these vans are manned by minority Muslim sailors of the Badala and Wagher castes from the Gulf of Kutch, especially the towns of Jam Salaya and Mandvi. So for me, the dhow or the vahan really, offers a unique vantage to think about the entanglement of sovereignty and capital. The dhow trade has historically functioned through distributed conceptions of sovereignty and an itinerant territoriality. However, since the colonial period, these mobile circuits have been pushed into the underbelly of the global economy through the legal regimes of colonial and then post-colonial states. Yet today, the dhow trade depends on differences created by national borders. Dhows, after all, function as an economy of arbitrage, bringing goods found in abundance in one region to another, the price differences and government policies in these distant markets creating value for the trade. As a result, these intermediaries in global shipping are in some moments made illicit and at other times complicit with state authorities. So centering the Vahan and the Indian Ocean's long history of trade and exchange, I take what Eng Seng Ho has called a view from the boat, a counterpoint to Eurocentric histories and concepts of interconnectedness, mobilities, and universalism. As Eng Seng Ho has elsewhere argued, the very idea of society in Western social theory is based on boundedness, where society has been theorized for a state and vice versa, new conceptual tools needed to understand old mobile societies. Taking this charge seriously, then, the book focuses on the social fabric of this mobile maritime seafaring community from Kutch in Western India. And you can see the two towns, Mandvi, and the red dot near Kambalia is Jam Salaya on the other side of the Gulf. So theorizing from this social world, the book is structured around an interplay between Kutchi concepts of voyages or goes and moorings or practices and structures or regulatory mechanisms that make possible this trade out of Gujarat or out of Kutch, really. Mobility, as we know, is contingent upon the possibilities of a mooring. After all, a mooring is a point of arrival, of departure, and a place of waiting. In the book, then, I emphasize not only movement through the voyage, but also points of mooring, places or sites upon which dhows come to depend upon to continue circulation. I use the concept of the mooring to refer to regulatory mechanisms and forms of labor and exchange around which the dhow trade pivots. Each chapter of the book then moves from one conceptual mooring and location to another, suggesting that it is in the relation between moorings and voyages that the entanglement between capital and sovereignty is made visible. So to offer you a closer look at these conceptual moorings that I'm interested in the rest of this talk, I focus on two of these, arbitrage and patronage, and show how these intersected during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll begin with arbitrage and then move on to patronage to show how mobile societies of Muslim seafarers from Kutch harness these long-standing forms as they move across the Indian Ocean, extracting value across a fractured seascape. Sorry. Arbitrage as a practice depends on movement of goods from one place where they might be found cheap to another where the same goods can be sold dearly. As anthropologist Kevin Donovan has argued, arbitrage entails difference, profit being made by the, quote, cultivation and capitalization of the disjuncture of jurisdiction, measurement, and appearance. Not unlike Jane Geyer's marginal gains, it is through translation between different commodities and currencies that profits might be made. Yet this profit is not without risk. Transport, an often under-theorized sector of exchange, is perhaps the riskiest, this risk often falling upon the body of transporters, such as sailors. It is this movement between risk and profit and arbitrage that I seek to highlight, suggesting that arbitrage is not without risk, but is made possible through the labor of sailors who move across jurisdictions. These sailors, already minority lower caste Muslims in Gujarat, which we know as the laboratory of Hindutva, not only contend with their marginal status in India, but are often invisible as they make trade and transport possible across the Indian Ocean in areas where no other forms of shipping are available. These sailors who come from castes historically associated with seafaring and piracy today face risk and danger at sea as they navigate across multiple jurisdictions. These risks are exacerbated by sanctions regimes and policing in the Persian Gulf, the sailor being subject to arrest by state authorities, especially in spaces where state sovereignty and jurisdiction are unsettled. In the ethnographic work that follows, I trace the dynamics that resulted in the arrest of Yusuf, one sailor from Mandvi during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. On May 24th, 2020, I received a call from Ahmed, Yusuf's brother based in Mandvi. I assumed he was calling to wish me for Eid al-Fitr, but Ahmed was not calling in celebration. Rather than beginning the call as we usually did with a 5-minute-long greeting, Ahmed uncharacteristically jumped right into it. "Have you heard what happened to Yusuf?" he asked tentatively. "No, what happened? I just spoke to him." "He's been picked up. They've all been picked up and arrested." Ahmed interrupted me, his voice quivering over the phone. "By whom? Where?" I asked, biting my lip. "They were taken by the Iranian Coast Guard, all 11 of them, and the van has been impounded. Yusuf is in jail in Keshem. We knew he shouldn't have gone to work for them," he lamented. I was confused. "But I just spoke to him a few days ago. What happened?" Yusuf had called me only 5 days ago to tell me that he was about to set off on a voyage to Karachi. He had been hoping to come home, but ports and flights to India were closed due to COVID-19 lockdowns. And so he had stayed on in Dubai, continuing to work despite not being home for over a year and a half. Although he hadn't sent me updates on his voyage as he normally would, I assumed it was because he was still en route without any cell phone service. Besides, his phone would have been impounded by authorities in Karachi, communication, of course, limited for Indian sailors in Pakistani ports. But instead, Ahmed told me what had really happened. 2 days ago, the dhow, the Al Imran, had set off from Dubai towards Pakistan. It was loaded with electronics, TVs, fridges, cigarettes, and even medicines. Although they had manifests issued for Karachi, they were not going there. They had been given a location on GPS. They dropped anchor at this location at sea and began offloading the cargo onto fishing boats from Iran. Even as goods were being transferred, they were intercepted by the Iranian Coast Guard. The Indian crew and the Iranian fishermen have all been arrested. The cargo on the vessel have been impounded. But they weren't even in Iranian waters. They were in Omani territorial waters. But now what can we do? Yusuf and the crew are being held in Keshem. You know he hadn't gotten a job for over a year, and he knew that the vessel owners were always up to shady business. But what choice did he have? And now this? I didn't know how to console Ahmed. The line was silent, but I had so many questions. How was Yusuf? What would happen now? Why was the Iranian Coast Guard patrolling outside territorial waters? And of course, what were the conditions in jail? And what could we possibly do? Despite the shock of the crisis, I thought to ask Ahmed the most pragmatic question. What about diesel? Was there any diesel being traded? I asked. He sighed. No diesel this time. A relief, since the sentence for diesel smuggling is much harsher than smuggling other contraband from Iran. But there were other worries. Yusuf was not young or healthy. 53 and diabetic, Ahmed and the rest of his family were worried. Did he have his medication? And what of COVID-19? Images of the news from Iran came in waves of hospitals with no beds, doctors trying to treat patients without medication or oxygen, patients gasping to death even as overworked doctors tried to keep up their morale by dancing in their scrubs in the face of this undefeatable virus, whose effects were amplified by sanctions that blocked access to life-saving medication. COVID-19 could not be contained, neither within prison walls nor within the country, which itself was closed with no flights in or out. No one could even go check on Yusuf. We were all still in lockdown. Ahmed and his family in Mandvi, me in Bombay, and Yusuf locked up in Keshim. I stared at a map of the Indian Ocean on my phone, imagining the Al Imran in the blue space between Dubai and Bandar Abbas, arrested in place even as warm waters flow the distance between Mandvi and Keshim. May 27th, 2020. A +98 number flashed on my phone. Iran. Yusuf was calling from a detention center in Keshim. I'm fine. They're giving us 3 meals a day, including meat, and conditions are not bad, he said. The other crew members are with him, including 4 members of the Dow owner's family. It was a relief that they were together. Maybe since the family is involved, the Dow owners will move faster in doing what needs to be done. There is no COVID here, don't worry. Yusuf was, as always, reassuring, but also practical. Take the Dow owner's number and call him. Maybe you can do something. I quickly jotted down the number of his employer in Mandvi. His niece's husband, the Dow owner's brother, was also with them. You know them. You've been to their house, Yusuf reminded me. See what information you can get from them. Yusuf could not talk long, but reassured me that he would call again in a few days. After hanging up, I remembered that this was not Yusuf's first experience of being in prison. I recalled a confession he had made to me years ago in 2014, and I have known Yusuf since 2011, so we have this long-standing friendship. As we had stood near the shipbuilding yard in his hometown of Mandvi, in the shadow of a half-built vahan, Yusuf had told me softly, "You know, Nidhi Bain, I've spent a year in Tihar jail in the 1990s. My father was so angry." I nodded, not pressing for details. I was caught smuggling gold. He then looked down, ashamed. Yusuf's arrest, whilst worrisome, was not unusual. Vahan sailors from India today are often caught smuggling goods to Iran, using free trade zones and ports in the UAE as hubs for this trans-regional trade. The Indian embassy in Bandar Abbas even has a special helpline for Indian seafarers, some of whom end up in Iran due to some mishap at sea or then on smuggling charges. Yet, as the operator at the end of this helpline told me, cases of arrest at sea on charges of smuggling had increased exponentially in recent years, especially due to international sanctions against trade with Iran. So since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the US has imposed sanctions on Iran, attempting to limit its influence and power. These sanctions have operated on various scales depending on relations between Tehran, Washington, and international bodies such as the EU and UN. Sanctions have included trade embargoes, financial and banking sanctions, bans on arms and weapons technology transfers, and sanctions on Iran's energy sector, all of which have produced economic, environmental, and health crises in Iran. Insecurity produced by sanctions has also led to a greater suppression of dissent and strengthened the power of ruling elites. And this organization, No Sanctions on Iran, does some pretty incredible advocacy work against sanctions. Yet, new trans-regional networks in a shadow economy have emerged to evade sanctions and restrictions and enable the movement of goods and capital to and from Iran. As Nargis Irami and Arang Keshavarzian have argued, the Islamic Revolution in Iran led to an increase in informal trade and smuggling, not only due to US-led international sanctions, but also because of regulations in post-revolutionary Iran that simultaneously restricted trade and led to the creation of new free trade zones in the Persian Gulf. This has facilitated new networks of smuggling in the gaps through maritime trade in the Persian Gulf that build upon Iranian merchants' old, long-standing connections to Dubai and other ports now in the UAE. This trade is often tolerated by Iranian officials as it provides for essential goods and opportunities for state officials to profit from corruption and patronage. While scholars have, of course, focused on the impact of sanctions within Iran, the effect of sanctions also ripple out across the Indian Ocean. Sanctions and their attendant smuggling networks have created a different kind of economy for vans that operate between India, East Africa, and the Persian Gulf. While much of this trade, the movement of goods between UAE and Iran, takes place on dhows from Iran, vahans from Kutch are also involved in transshipment. For these Indian dhow owners, sailors, and the Iranian, Emirati, and Somali merchants they work with, sanctions have provided an opportunity for arbitrage. Ports in the UAE becoming key hubs, or what I call moorings, for transshipment. In this economy of arbitrage, exchange of goods takes place not only on land, but also at sea. For example, cheap diesel from Iran is traded in the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman. Of course, due to sanctions and fuel subsidies in Iran, diesel from Iran is much cheaper than diesel from elsewhere, especially as it is smuggled out by Iranian fishing vessels and dhows. Kachchi Vahans then not only run on cheap diesel from Iran, but also help move it within and beyond the Strait of Hormuz. Some of these dhows spend months at sea, engaging in ship-to-ship transfers of diesel purchased from Iranian fishing vessels, and then even sell this diesel to container ships in the Persian Gulf. Other dhows might carry diesel alongside other legal cargoes loaded in the UAE for the ports of Somalia. Alongside this diesel trade under the patronage of Indian, Emirati, and Iranian dhow owners, dhow captains and engineers engaged in a diesel trade of their own, peddling diesel to other dhows at sea or then in Somali ports for a profit that would go directly into their own pockets rather than the dhow owners. Arbitrage, then, was also a strategy that allowed sailors themselves possibilities for accumulation. For example, Yusuf himself was a well-known diesel trader, skimming, pilfering, and trading in diesel on his own account, even as he undertook voyages moving goods owned by merchants. Dhows then literally and figuratively run on diesel, the unit of the barrel or barmil of diesel, becoming a medium of exchange for dhow owners, merchants, and sailors, profit produced not only through commercial, but also jurisdictional arbitrage. While scholarship has generally traced the decline of the dhow economy across the Indian Ocean to the rise of oil and containerized shipping, as these trades I describe here suggest, oil and diesel have only provided yet another market for dhows to operate in, for dhow traders and sailors to accumulate profit in the underbelly of this trade. However, this is not a simple story of value created through price differences, but the possibility for such value making is intrinsically tied to questions of sovereignty and jurisdiction, not only in the present, but also in the past. So I'm going to kind of shift gears here and talk a little bit about the history of arbitrage in the Indian Ocean. And as many of you might be familiar, arbitrage for Indian Ocean merchants was a calculated, intentional trading strategy. Its mechanisms are perhaps most visible in the trade in currencies, not just paper money and coins, but also commodities that were used as media of exchange. As historian Stephen Searles has shown, in the pre-colonial Western Indian Ocean, there were a variety of competing currencies, such as coins of gold, silver, copper, cloth, salt, shells, beads, grain, cattle, promissory notes, and bills of exchange. Each of these circulated in different areas that were socially and culturally understood, the currency system being, quote, shaped by the tension between the local and the trans-regional. Questions of sovereignty came to be embedded within the system of exchange, as in the 20th century, states exclusively minted gold, silver, and copper coins, although traders who moved between different states used different currencies to exchange goods across the region. In the Red Sea, for instance, in the 20th century, imperial European currencies such as the Italian lire, French franc, and British-backed Egyptian pound displaced other dynamic multiple currencies, often resulting in a widespread loss of capital. But the imperial system did not completely dominate exchange, as traders continued to arbitrage between currencies as they traded locally, regionally, and globally, often through illicit trade and smuggling. As historian Johann Matthews argued, merchants rejected and subverted new currency forms that assumed bounded economies, their behavior shaping monetary policies across the Arabian Sea. The trade in gold in the 20th century provides an example in which opportunities for arbitrage were exploited through smuggling. During World War II, as prices for precious metals soared in Europe, gold stored in India, which is, of course, traditionally seen as a sink for gold, was smuggled out by dhows, this gold making its way to Europe via the Arabian Peninsula. This led to new anti-smuggling measures across the Indian Ocean. Nevertheless, even after the war, merchants smuggled gold back into India, signaling a careful strategy whereby gold was stored and traded when opportunities for arbitrage arose. And we see this even today. Not unlike gold, the case of the Maria Teresa Thaler offers another window into thinking about arbitrage. In the Red Sea, the Maria Teresa dollar, a coin made of fine silver originally issued by Vienna, remained in circulation long after it was produced. It was especially popular in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Arabian Peninsula, its value exceeding the official price of silver. Akinobu Kuroda argues that the Maria Teresa dollar remained popular through the 19th and 20th century as it acted as a, quote, complementary interface between multiple markets. While the pound sterling or rupee flowed in international and interregional trade, and salt, cloth, and lires and copper coins were used in more local trades in the Red Sea region, the Maria Teresa dollar acted as a buffer between these currencies and linked local markets to interregional and global exchange systems, merchants arbitraging between currencies used in these different zones of exchange. So I offer this very broad and loose history of arbitrage in the Indian Ocean to situate present practices of arbitrage between different currencies and commodities. Present dynamics in trade from Iran offer a glimpse into the ways in which arbitrage tactics allow for an entry into global trade through multiple media of exchange. In Iran, sanctions regimes have led to a flourishing of smuggling of commodities via Turkey and the UAE, especially as the value of the rial has plummeted. As Emrah Yildiz has argued, sanctions have created a sphere of exchange where commodities with intrinsic values serve as media of exchange, Iranians becoming nested within global spheres of exchange through cross-border commodity trade. The diesel trade at sea offers one such example of a cross-border commodity trade where diesel is both a commodity and a currency that offers one pathway to link local, regional, and global markets. Today, Dows trade in diesel through the unit of the barmil or barrel. Prices of diesel in Iran are, of course, cheaper than elsewhere in the world due to fuel subsidies and sanctions. The diesel is then smuggled out of Iran by fishing boats who then sell this diesel at sea. Dows then trade in this diesel at sea or then sell it in Somalia, where diesel prices are higher than in the UAE or Iran. This trade, where diesel is bought and sold in US dollars, and of course the price of diesel is pegged to the US dollar, provides both Indian Dow sailors as well as their Iranian counterparts access to the US dollar, diesel becoming akin to the Maria Teresa dollar, a commodity that acts as an interface between local, regional, and global markets and provides an opportunity for arbitrage. But this is not only an arbitrage based on price differentials, but also differing government policies. In trading diesel or other goods between Iran and the UAE, profit is made possible through jurisdictional arbitrage, or what Jeffrey Kahn has called a search for the legally advantageous spaces of a landscape fractured by land and sea. After all, Dow sailors would conduct ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, where not one single authority could claim jurisdiction, or then would attempt to conduct these transfers in territorial waters where authorities were more likely to turn a blind eye. Omani patrol boats are least bothered by us. The Americans and Iranians are different, though, much more dangerous. Dow captains would tell me many ship-to-ship transfers taking place in Omani waters. While American patrol presence in the Persian Gulf reduced after 2018, sailors would often say that this has led to an expansion of Iranian presence at sea. Earlier, they would only patrol in Iranian territorial waters, but now they are everywhere, a young sailor told me in November 2020. This may have been due to COVID-19, but also because of reduced American naval presence during the Trump years. The Indian Ocean is a liquid terrain upon which multiple regulatory authorities might be moving, expanding their jurisdiction and sovereign power. It is by moving between these regulatory authorities through jurisdictional arbitrage at sea that the full value of price differentials might be realized and captured. Yet for sailors, this form of arbitrage is, of course, not without risk. The notion of arbitrage has been understood by anthropologists as an ambiguous category, one that is not devoid of risk, in contrast with financial theory, but like speculation, is predicated on risk and is extensible beyond financial derivatives. Yet risk in arbitrage has been understood to be largely financial, but arbitrage in long-distance trade also entails risking the laboring body of the sailor who goes out to sea. It is this laboring sailor who was always culpable as he would be caught red-handed and arrested, unlike the other actors involved in profiting from this trade, such as dhow owners based in Kutch, merchants and shipping agents in Iran or the UAE. Arbitrage, even in the case of long-distance trade then, produces value through labor, the classic mode of value creation, the sailor's body and life held in abeyance in arbitrage. Arbitrage, however, not only requires the movement of sailors, but also a mooring, a place that is stable enough so that goods can be transshipped. Ports in the UAE, such as Dubai, offer one such pivot for arbitrage. Ports such as Dubai act as a stable location of transshipment, a node through which goods can be arbitraged. Yet this mooring is made possible not only through advantageous geographical location on the Persian Gulf with its proximity to other ports and oil-producing regions, but also through policies that are favorable for trade and transport. The Persian Gulf, as we know, is dotted by port cities that have risen and fallen based on the trade policies of the authorities that have governed them. The rise of Dubai as an entreport is linked to the decline of ports on the Persian coast, such as Bandar Abbas, Linga, and Bushehr in the mid-19th century. With increased taxes being levied in these ports, beginning in 1902, Dubai's ruling family, the Maktoums, strategically applied policies such as low customs duties and abolished taxes to attract Arab and Persian merchants to this once sleepy pearling town. By the turn of the 20th century, Dubai came to be known for its free port. The discovery of oil in the 1960s enabled the ruling family to develop multiple ports such as Port Rashid, a dry dock, a World Trade Center, and the free trade zone of Jebel Ali, traffic increasing through these ports since then. Yet as oil reserves in Dubai dried up, they further developed its ports, becoming a logistics hub, the world's third largest re-export to transshipment hub after Singapore and Hong Kong. Government authorities in other parts of the Indian Ocean and even in the US have viewed this model as a model of success. Much of this success has been attributed to the UAE's ease of customs procedures, low administrative costs, and efficient infrastructure. These policies enable transshipment swiftly and on the cheap, political stability, making Dubai and other ports in the UAE even more attractive. The UAE's policy of re-export echo ideas that were long floating across pre-colonial Indian Ocean port cities. Sanjay Subramaniam has shown that pre-colonial Indian Ocean port cities were governed to encourage trade, major entreports such as 15th century Malacca or Hormuz being characterized by policies such as low customs duties. These old logics of trade that were characteristic of Indian Ocean port cities have become entangled with neoliberal ideas about trade everywhere, in Dubai, Sharjah, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Although, of course, British coercion played much of a role in the making of these entreports, it is no coincidence that these, the world's largest re-export centers, are all Indian Ocean ports that have emulated these principles. And indeed, Dubai's rise as a port city is linked precisely to this policy of cheap re-export. Even before the discovery of oil, Dubai was already becoming a hub for the transshipment of gold from the 1940s on. As the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 saw a shift away from the gold standard and the adoption of the US dollar as the singular currency of trade in the new international order created in the aftermath of the world wars, Dubai became a location from which gold could be traded and arbitraged. Imported cheaply into Dubai and Sharjah from Europe, much of this gold was shipped by dhows to the port of Bombay. This trade continued long after the world wars. As India gained independence, the movement of foreign exchange and gold was tightly regulated until economic liberalization in 1991. And we're all familiar with this story of gold smuggling between Dubai and Bombay, but I just wanted to trace some of this and show you why it's connected to the diesel trade. Gold was, of course, transported on planes, on ships, and most notoriously on dhows, which are still associated with gold smuggling in India. Port cities such as Dubai and Sharjah were transformed by the capitalization of arbitrage opportunities that the gold trade offered. Sailors from Jam Salaya and Mandvi, such as Yusuf, were deeply involved in this gold trade as they were the ones to carry gold between Dubai and Bombay on dhows. Yet, this economy of arbitrage was never without risk. The risk of arbitrage here falls upon the body of laborers, on dhow sailors like Yusuf, who are subject to arrest when caught moving goods across the Indian Ocean. So let me then return to the story of Yusuf. In April 2020, as Iran saw a surge of COVID-19 cases, Dubai and Sharjah banned the arrival of dhows from Iran, hoping to contain the pandemic. Indian vans, accustomed to smuggling diesel, now came to be used to smuggle other goods, usually carried by smaller Iranian dhows. It was at this moment that the Al Imran sailed towards Iran, a ship-to-ship transfer of consumer goods taking place at sea. Yet, unlike a ship-to-ship transfer of diesel, where pipes could easily bind fishing vessels and dhows together, and just as easily detach them when patrollers were on the horizon, a ship-to-ship transfer of heavier cargo of bulky consumer goods was far more labor-intensive. It was in this process that the Al Imran was caught by Iranian patrollers. Although the dhow owner was looking to capitalize on gaps created by pandemic restrictions and sanctions, this transaction ultimately resulted in a financial loss for the merchant, the shipping agent, as well as the dhow owner. But for the sailor, his body and his life itself were at risk. Yusuf and the rest of the crew spending over 15 uncertain months in jail in Iran. 15 months of waiting, during which Yusuf was moved from a detention center in Keshem to a prison in Bandar Abbas. 450 days of trying to get news of the progress of the case, waiting for a verdict. 15 months of trying to send money through brokers in the UAE to Iran for Yusuf's jail card so that he could make phone calls and supplement meager prison meals. 15 months during which Yusuf's 19-year-old son, Mohammed, suddenly found himself the sole breadwinner of his family, even as he received reports from others in prison that Yusuf's health had turned for the worse. 15 months during which Yusuf's oldest brother, Ilyas, died suddenly of COVID-19 during India's deadly second wave. Yusuf's wife, father, and daughter also contracted COVID, his father spending weeks in hospital. 15 months of trying to get the dhow owner in India, the Iranian merchant, and the Indian shipping agent in Dubai to give us information about their case, the disappointment of unanswered phone calls stinging every day. Months of calling the Indian consulate in Tehran and Bandar Abbas to see if they can help with the logistics of finding lawyers and brokers in Iran, only to be told, and this is a very familiar form for all of us, "Madam, these are smugglers, they have broken the law, they are degenerates, and we can do nothing to help them." Months of petitioning authorities in India, from Gujarat's chief minister to the shipping minister of the country, with no response. We talked to journalists in India to raise the issue as a humanitarian cause, and they dejectedly told us that the right-wing government would do nothing for sailors because they are Muslim. 15 months of daily calls between Bandar Abbas and Mandvi to make sure that families across the Indian Ocean were still alive. 60 weeks of being told that maybe, just maybe this week they would be released. 15 months later, Yusuf was finally released from prison after the dhow owner paid the fine of approximately $8,000 per person. Nevertheless, a year and a half passed in uncertainty, cycles of death and birth folding upon themselves, even as Yusuf's life itself was under arrest. Yet, this is not simply a story of abjection. Through the 15 months of being imprisoned, Yusuf himself negotiated his capture by arbitraging across multiple patrons, even whilst behind bars. How then did he harness the hierarchical relationship of patronage, even in captivity during simultaneous COVID-19 lockdowns across the Indian Ocean? Yusuf's calls to me from jail had a purpose. He wanted me to mediate between him and the dhow owner, his patron Aziz. Aziz, the dhow owner, was shocked and felt helpless about the arrest as his own mobility was restricted. 4 of his brothers had also been arrested. He could not go to Iran as flights from India were closed, and he was relying on Hussein, the Iranian Emirati merchant whose goods they were transporting, to follow up on the case. Indeed, over the 15 months that the crew was imprisoned, Aziz was caught between Hussein and sailors and their families, all of whom petitioned Aziz for the quick release of the sailors. Aziz was, after all, their employer and patron, and therefore responsible for them. While delays were wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic, it is actually not uncommon at all for cases such as Yusuf's to drag on for years, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so Yusuf negotiated the case through a form of labor he was intimately familiar with: patronage. Anthropologist Jan Bremen has usefully defined patronage as a pattern of relationships in which members of hierarchically arranged groups possess mutually recognized, not exactly stipulated rights and obligations involving mutual aid and preferential treatment. The bond between patron and client is personal and is contracted and continued by mutual agreement for an indeterminate time. In studies of patronage, the master-servant relationship is one of mutual dependence, whereby the servant as a client has certain rights and obligations. His master as a patron was expected to be affectionate, generous, and promote the interests of his client. In exchange, the servant was expected to be loyal and respectful, providing not only labor, but also serving the interests of his patron. Patronage as labor relation exceeded the financial relationship. Following this understanding of patronage, it was the duty of the dhow owner to fight for the release of those under his employment. Yet while Aziz and his family were the dhow owners and for sailors their main patron, the responsibility to pay fines for the release of the cargo and the vessel fell upon the cargo consignee, in this case, Hussein, an Iranian who lived between Iran and the UAE. Over the course of the 15 months, Hussein and Aziz appealed the case in court and argued who would pay for what, their status as patrons being redefined through this process. For the imprisoned sailor, this negotiation between patrons produced deep uncertainty. Neither Aziz nor Hussein were forthcoming about the progress of the case. Yusuf knew many sailors who had been arrested in Iran and left there to live out their sentences for years, even before the pandemic, as patrons failed to bail them out. For Yusuf, stuck in jail, Aziz and Hussein's lack of clarity was anxiety-producing, as it signaled the transformation of patronage into exploitation. After all, patronage as a labor system hinges on patrons offering total care for their clients, especially in times of need, in return for clients' labor and loyalty. This system, of course, slips into exploitation when patrons do not hold up their end of the bargain. So Yusuf continually underlined Aziz and his family's moral obligation to bail out the crew, reminding them that the relationship between the dhow owner and sailor far exceeded that of wage labor and was one of patronage, or what Anastasia Pilyavsky has called a living moral idiom of relatedness. Yet patronage is also key to defining the self for both patron and clients, and for group cohesion, especially amongst Badalas and Wagers in Kutch. Given that status is dependent on one's position in the system, patrons and clients would compete with and among one another. In Van labor, this system of patronage extends to all levels of the community. Dhow owners competed with each other as patrons, while sailors sought prestige and hoped to become big men within their own class, continually seeking new, more generous patrons. While this was the case even before the COVID-19 outbreak, Yusuf creatively renegotiated the terms of his captivity by using methods that built upon his prior experiences of precarity and patronage. He did so by creating a competition between patrons, bringing their status on the line by arbitraging across these patrons. While the status of patrons has been a pivotal factor in patronage systems, creatively pitching patrons against each other in a moment of crisis through the multiple lockdowns, restrictions, and suspended temporalities of the COVID-19 pandemic made this competition between patrons even more urgent and effective. Acutely aware of how patronage works, Yusuf harnessed its moral obligation and appealed to the dhow owner by making his status precarious. Yusuf negotiated among different patrons involved in the case, such as Aziz, the Kutchi dhow owner, Hussein, the Iranian Emirati cargo consignee, by transforming his friend, the anthropologist, me, into a potential patron who could negotiate between the two, in effect creating a competition among patrons. Tired of waiting for Aziz and Hussein, Yusuf then appealed to me as a patron. Over the phone, we concocted a plan whereby I would offer to bail Yusuf, and only Yusuf, out of jail. Yusuf hoped that this process would be immediate and that he would no longer be bound to either Hussein or Aziz. But he also hoped that by finding a competing patron, he would be able to shame Hussein and Aziz into bailing him and the rest of the crew out immediately. And indeed, this is what came to pass. Upon hearing that Yusuf had found a different patron who would front the money for his release, Aziz became anxious. What would the rest of the crew, including his own brothers and family, think if Yusuf were to be released before any of them because of a different patron? Aziz risked losing his status as patron. If word of delays in releasing the crew spread, his position as a respected dhow owner would be jeopardized. Fearing a loss of status, Aziz immediately got to work and somehow found the funds to pay for the crew's release. In November 2021, Yusuf and the rest of the crew finally returned home. So, to conclude, arbitrage and patronage, old Indian Ocean concepts drawn from a mobile society, have not simply disappeared in this world of container shipping. Instead, these forms of exchange and labor organization are remade to create value in a historically sedimented manner. Arbitraging in the gaps between shipping lines and differences created by national borders and state sovereignty, as well as patrons, the dhow trade produces value by risking the body and life of transporters, lower caste Muslim Kutchi sailors, as they move across a fractured seascape. Sanctions regimes, after all, have also resulted in an expansion of authoritarian state sovereignty through everyday jurisdictional technicalities and policing at sea. The dhow then moves between land and sea, navigates between jurisdictions, and capitalizes on difference, value created by risking the body of the sailor caught between land and sea. Dhows become entangled with practices of sovereignty and produce value by connecting markets and people often left out in the global economy. The possibility of accumulation is then predicated on a maneuvering of sovereignty and historical forms of exchange and labor organization in a mobile society that has often been written out of longer histories of capital. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Nidhi. A lovely, expansive paper, which could have alternatively be entitled The Anthropologist and the Smuggler. I love the narrative of Yusuf, which ran through the entire exposition, which actually allowed us a purchase on the people involved in this rather than more abstract forces and so on. What I liked particularly was the fact of how you dealt with the issue of time. And this is something that I would probably want you to dwell a little bit more on. So you have the longue durée of mercantile activity and capitalism. So the how trade is part of something that is immediately shaped by circumstances, as well as something that's been going on for a few hundred years. You have the short-term alignments of geopolitical alignments that are happening, the sanctions regime against Iran, and the space within which the dhow trade operates. And finally, the conjuncture of COVID, the short-term conjuncture of COVID, which then entraps Yusuf at a particular time and in a particular mode. So to go back to Eng Seng Ho's work, which you invoked earlier, there is this notion of an oceanic or a maritime time, or the time of the ocean, as it were, thinking about times that are beyond the colonial, times that are beyond the carapace of capitalism, as we understand modern capitalism. And one instance of this is the very resonant example that you used of the coinage of the Habsburg Empire, the double-headed eagle coin, which still circulates. And this we know to be true of many port towns, that your Venetian doubloons, Roman sestertii, and there are multiple coinages that continue to circulate, have value, and are, and you'll find this in travelers' accounts from the 15th century onwards. So this question of time is crucial. The second, I love the idea of moorings, because very often with the turn to oceanic studies, we've become engulfed with literary metaphors of circulation, fluidity. So the sea becomes a space in which people are set adrift, find freedom, and so on. Moorings reminds us that there is this constant, what Brathwaite called tidalectics, that the land and sea are always connected. You have to think about states and their intervention, which is very crucial in your work, questions of patronage, which are land-based. The person who hires you, the person who will speak for you, whether it's the anthropologist or your employer. So this question of moorings allows us to actually think about the relation between land and sea. and to see it as a dyad. The third question that I had really was about, and this is a much debated question. I mean, you use the word smuggling, right? And I wonder whether another word, we've had this debates going on for the last 20 years, licit trade, illicit trade, smuggling, because a lot of using the word smuggling already brings in a certain vocabulary of the law that is determined by the state. And so when we begin to think about the longer temporalities on the ocean, as well as the multiple lives on the ocean, could we think about another term, another set of terms, and so on? Perhaps you could start with these and then, meanwhile, give people time to mull over the questions. So just to kick it off.
Thank you so much, Dilip. I mean, these are really fantastic and big questions that I'm still sort of, working out as I continue to work on this particular chapter, but also the book more generally. And I mean, I think, the issue of time, I think so many of us have been grappling with this. Like, how do you deal with the longue durée? And in some ways, I mean, with the ethnographic work, right? Like, there was no way to kind of see this without situating it within the longer history, because sailors themselves would invoke it, right? This is a history that they also remember, and their lives are deeply wrapped up in those histories. Like, for instance, the gold trade, and how that maps on to the diesel trade. But these are much more short term than the kind of broader swath that I'm looking at. And I think there is no other way to do this work other than to think of it in these kinds of long-term, short-term, longue durée, and like very urgent short-term events, right, that occur, because this is also what being at sea looks like, right? Mm-hmm. Like, there's a way in which like sailors would also invoke this, that nation states are very new. Like, we've been here before nation states were here. They invoke this, and the practice of going to sea and what time is at sea is also one that stretches and then contracts, stretches and then contracts. And I mean, for me, I think it's, the challenge of a chapter like this, or doing ethnographic work, I think, is that you fall the risk of either spending too much time in the present without being able to situate it within the longue durée. And then for folks who don't work on the Indian Ocean, I often get the question, the dreaded question of like, well, doesn't anything ever change? Right? Are you giving us a static history? And the point of it is that this is not a static history. Things transform. So even the patronage relationships that I'm talking about, or arbitrage, right, as tactics, they change over time, and the currencies change. But in many ways, things also remain the same, right? We're so wedded to the idea of like historical rupture at a certain moment. But at the same time, for some of these folks, it's not really a rupture. They think of time in a much more kind of, and they would force me to think of it in this way as well, to think of it in the longue durée. So I keep going back to what the sailors are pushing me for, and also the experience of being at sea, which is something that they would also talk about in thinking about time. This is not really an answer, I think, but it's sort of
something that we're all thinking about.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think we're all trying to figure this out. The moorings concept, again, this kind of structures the entire book. And I came to it in several different ways, because when I first started this project in 2010, I don't even remember at this point, but in 2010, a lot of the discourse at the time was around securitizing the coast. I started the project in Mombasa in Kenya, and then started doing work in India. And the conversation at the time was deeply around, coastal security, where these dhows were seen as somehow illegally transporting weapons and people in Kenya, but also in India, especially in the aftermath of the attacks in Bombay in 2006. 2008. So in many ways, the moorings concept both sort of, for me, illustrates a kind of move to secure, but then also this movement between land and sea that you very correctly point out, right? Because with these sailors who are moving across multiple ports, the whole goal is not just to remain at sea, but is to eventually arrive somewhere, wait, and then move on. And in my own work, concepts like arbitrage and patronage offer conceptual moorings where they structure or regulatory mechanisms that structure the trade, but you also leave them behind and move on to another concept, right? This is the way circulation operates, where it's sort of between land and sea, but it takes a multitude of regulatory forms for this trade to function. So the moorings concept really comes from that relationship between land and sea, but also thinking more conceptually about what are the mechanisms that structure this trade, not just state regulatory mechanisms, but within the community itself. The question of smuggling. I never really call it smuggling, this title. I think I just kind of wrote it out quickly. But part of why it also works is because sailors themselves have a conception of what they do when it comes to, trading gold or trading diesel. These are seen as, harmless commodities that aren't going to cause damage to anyone except the government. So they call it daan chori, right? Tax evasion. So this is a very legitimate form of commerce. It's very licit within these communities, whereas smuggling is immediately seen as illicit or illegal, right? So even thinking of the licit, this kind of, smuggling, if we want to call it that, or daan chori, perfectly morally sound, right? Because you're only stealing from a state that is doing absolutely nothing for you, right? Whereas trading in drugs or trading in weapons, completely haram, right? Like this is not something morally reprehensible. So whereas the Indian state wants to cast these sailors as smugglers of the dangerous lot, what they're saying is that actually, well, everyone smuggles gold in India. We know this. Diesel isn't harming anyone. In fact, it is what people require across these ports in the Indian Ocean. So it's a different kind of moral economy of smuggling, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you. And the two questions in the chat box. So those of you who have questions, perhaps you could put it in the chat box, or like Murari has done, raise your hand. But the two questions in the chat box, Nidhi, are you able to see them?
Maybe I can see them.
Related questions. So maybe you could take that up and then we can Murari ask his question.
So I see that there are questions around, other kinds of smuggling in the Indian Ocean. One is antiquities and works of art, and the other are human smuggling. I don't know, actually. And with art, I'm not sure. And I've definitely not seen that in the Dow trade. Human smuggling, it's really sort of, not on board Vahans. Because again, although we imagine that these are free-floating, vessels in the Indian Ocean, they're actually deeply regulated and securitized. So there might be other forms of vessels that might be engaged in sort of, the movement of people, but Vahans are so tightly regulated in ports that this is a rare thing that if it were ever to happen.
Murari, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, wonderful. I actually enjoyed it thoroughly because, as Dilip mentioned, archive-going historians find anthropological works really inspiring and kind of, so I could visualize lots of things becoming more visible to me. Otherwise, you don't really kind of, reading archives. And so it's very clear that the situation would have been far more complex even back in, let's say, early modern period, 16th, 17th century. But my question is why you find the dough trade kind of continuing in this area compared to, let's say, in Southeast Asia or somewhere else? in the Americas, where earlier forms of shipping or navigation existed. So, do we need to find an explanation in, geopolitics, or in the political economy, or specific geography, where perhaps there are certain areas in which you can't really access through big container shipping, and therefore you have to do with Doge. And second, you actually touched upon, but I wonder whether these communities who are actually manning these DAOs, do they come from all those traditional communities that actually worked at Tundales or Nakodash and so on? Do they have some sort of memories of that past, like the ancestors, somebody related to them from their community actually had worked in the past, something like that? So that's
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Murari, for these really great questions. I mean, in the longer, of course, in the book, I talk about these two precise things. And I mean, to your question of why does the DAO trade continue, especially in this area, I think there's a variety of reasons, right? For one, the DAO as the material form of the DAO lends itself to improvisation and flexibility, right? Flexibility is really the key thing here, where it has transformed in its form in many iterations, right? You now have generator-run DAOs that have become much larger. The size can keep changing. A DAO can last over 100 years. A Vahan really can last over 100 years if taken care of properly. So the form itself lends itself to improvisation and change and is not a fixed form. The second thing is, of course, as I underlined in this paper, that it's able to act as a feeder for larger container shipping lines. And actually, even during the World Wars, the British were using DAOs as feeders. So they've always had this, even despite the rise of steamships or container ships, they have had this role of, being the feeders to these other shipping lines in the Indian Ocean. But that being said, a lot of it has contracted, right? You can literally trace where DAOs are made now in Gujarat to a couple of ports. Mandvi, Jamsalaya, Porbandar, right? And Mandvi and Jamsalaya are really central. I mean, there's some in Jamnagar and a few in like Sikka, but really it is in these places. These are kind of the epicenters. And that has to do with your second question. Who are these communities? Are they traditional communities associated with this? Yes, of course. And the question of caste is really central here, right? Like these are Badalas and Wagers who are historically associated with seafaring and piracy. Hindu Kharvas, who used to be a part of this trade, have all managed to move into other sectors, even though they have this imagination of, the seafaring Vahan labor trade, but in fact, they have been able to move on to other things, whereas segregated Muslim communities in Mandvi and Jamsalaya, right? And you can see it in the city. In Mandvi, you have Mandvi proper, which is where you have, the old mansions and ruins. And then across the creek, you have Mota Salaya, which is where these Badala communities are. And Badalas certainly remember themselves, and I mean, colonial gazettes will say this too, that their seafaring communities worked as fishermen and also in these trades. And they certainly remember themselves and know themselves in that way. Wagers as well, you have Hindu Wagers as well as Muslim Wagers, but Wagers in Jamsalaya as well as Badala similarly trace themselves that way. And Wagers are much more linked to piracy in the northward, so to speak. So certainly, yes, these are communities that have these longer histories, but I don't want to romanticize it. This is a story of how caste operates within Muslim communities as well, right? And also one thing that they would keep emphasizing is that we actually do not have a choice, because the government in Gujarat is not going to build schools in our districts. It's not going to build roads so that we have access to, bigger cities immediately. And they are kind of ghettoized in Mandvi, in Jamsalaya. And this is also partially why Mandvi and Jamsalaya and these communities and the Dow trade actually continues, right? Is that this form of labor that's so tied to caste does not actually it's hard to break away from it. The hope and the dream for someone who's trying to get out of this labor form is to become a migrant laborer in the UAE, right? That is the only other option. So the two questions are actually very linked to each other. Why does the trade continue? It's linked to caste, because you have other Dhow, seafaring communities who don't need to do this. And you see, even on board like Iranian-owned or Emirati-owned vessels, you will find laborers who are Badala and Wagher from Jamsalaya and Mandvi. So they've become this kind of, not only from Gujarat, beyond Gujarat, become a kind of, and the migrant laborers who are working on board these vessels across the board, even on board tourist dhows, right? In Dubai, it is these guys who are running them, actually. So the two questions are very tied together. So I'm glad you asked it. Sorry for my very long.
No. I think the disappearance in, let's say, in Southeast Asia, like Bugis or others, like Ryukyus or Japanese. So perhaps the changes, then, if we have to extend this, then the changes in that society being kind of such that, those communities now found alternative means of livelihood, or they're integrated to some other activities or other economic activities.
I would have to think about this more, but my sense is that, even if you think of sort of fishing vessels, right? Beyond these dhows, like from my understanding in Southeast Asia, a lot of these communities are still involved in trading on fishing vessels, right? So the form itself may not be the same, but again, I would have to think more about the Southeast Asia question. But my sense is that part of it is tied to moving on to other kinds of seafaring occupations, right? Like in this case, Hindu dhow owners, many of them became sort of owners of large scale, like shipping companies, actually, or freight forwarders or brokers. Whereas in these communities, that did not happen or was not possible. But in Southeast Asia, it's a great question. I think I would have to do more work to see what that looks like. But my sense is that there's a different kind of movement, a different association with, the caste question, I think, is pretty big. And I'm going to keep circling back to that, because it's something that, keeps coming up in the interviews, but also in thinking about the longer history of Gujarat and in, what this caste formation actually means. I think it's central. Yeah.
But perhaps the commodity question comes into focus here as well, because you do mention diesel and gold. And I think there's something about the economy of the Middle East or the Arab countries, the centrality of carbon fuels, a whole host of things like that, which one could think about as well, perhaps. Are there any other questions? Could people raise their hands or indicate that they wish to say something?
I see there's a question on Somali pirates.
Okay.
And Somali pirates are said to have been actively operating in the region around Somalia. So how did this affect trade and smuggling in the Indian Ocean over time? So Jatin Dua is the best person to respond to this question. But in terms of sort of thinking about these Vahans and how piracy affected Vahans, and Jatin writes about this, that Vahans were often hijacked by pirates to be used as motherships to get to larger container vessels. So a lot of these folks that I worked with actually had stories of being hijacked or then having to work with what they call wardiyas, or like Somali protectors at sea, who would kind of navigate negotiations around piracy. There were also multiple rules that were put into place by the Director General of Shipping based in Bombay around when and where dhows could go or vahans could go. And they tried to make, the area around Somalia illegal for dhows to visit, but it was also literally the only place at the time that dhows were making any profits. So it was, again, like, you're going to place this restriction, but this is precisely where, say, for instance, diesel needs to go. And Dilip, thank you for your reminder about commodities. I think you're also spot on with gold. With oil in Southeast Asia, that could also be the case. And there is like a huge smuggling network of oil in the South China Sea. But again, I think this is a great question to think through. I hope that answers the question on piracy.
Actually, the interesting thing that Jatin shows in his work is that the persistence of the Somalian pirates, despite the fact that the US has a fleet out in the ocean and so on, also has to do with the implication of Lloyd's insurance in all of these activities, so that Lloyd's has an investment perhaps in continuing to insure ships against Somalian pirates. And so the Somalian pirates continue to exist on the ocean. So it's an insurance scam as much as the activity of piracy. I had two more questions. I mean, again, a bigger questions. You speak about the Indian Ocean network, and you showed a little diagram there, right, which extends from the Middle East to China, right? And I was wondering, to go back to the kind of questions that are raised by Renisa Mavani of the connected oceans, or thinking about the work of Jeremy Prestholt, for example, or Thomas McDowell, the fact that the Indian Ocean in an earlier time was connected to the Atlantic and the Pacific and so on, the trade in cotton, it's an African demand for cotton that drives industrialization in Salem, Massachusetts, the whole literature, right? So what could one actually, so in speaking about the Indian Ocean network as you do right now, is it something that we are dealing with a more immediate phenomenon where all those earlier affiliations have been severed, as it were, right? Or is it something that we don't need to talk about connected oceans anymore, that they were connected earlier, they aren't now, those kinds of questions. The second thing related to the fact that the Iranians, in your paper, the Iranian Coast Guard was operating outside of its region, right? They were in Omani waters almost. Now, what does all of that mean, right? Are there these lines in the ocean? And then you also spoke about UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which extended the territorial waters of a particular. So in that sense, the whole idea of where you can function to impose your territorial authority or extend it to the ocean becomes a fluid concept. So those two questions, which relate to where does land end, where do states end, right? One, and the second, where does the Indian Ocean end?
These are like the questions for our time, Dilip. Thank you for that. No, but let me start with connected oceans. And, as I was writing this chapter and thinking about oil, right, and diesel, like, how do you then trace this commodity that that comes out of, say, Iran or elsewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, is pegged to the US dollar and is moving in these ways, right? The ultimate, some of this diesel ends up in Somalia, some of it ends up on board container ships that are going off to the Atlantic even, right? Like, so if we're tracing trade in commodities, how does this particular commodity or this particular trade fit into sort of connecting these multiple oceans, right? But also, you see in the space of the Western Indian Ocean, right? It's actually some of the most busiest shipping lines in the world, precisely because of oil. And Lale Khalili's work has dealt with some of this. So if you're tracing it out of the Indian Ocean and thinking of a connected ocean through commodities, if it was once cotton, perhaps it is now oil that is connecting even Southeast Asia, right? Because a lot of the oil that is traded in Jebel Ali, for instance, is going off across multiple oceans, right? So what would it look like? What would tracing a commodity across these oceans then tell us about these connected oceans? But even in terms of thinking about sovereignty and jurisdiction, like the US and the kind of imperial might of the US, or the decline of the US, as we're seeing, happily, but what does that actually do for sovereignty and jurisdiction in the Indian Ocean? And the reason why this Iranian question of, like, expanding jurisdiction outside of Iranian territorial waters is interesting is because they were only able to do it when US naval forces pulled out of that region, right?
Right.
So they're only able to expand in, and again, Iran did not sign on to all of the clauses of UNCLOS. So it's still sort of in a muddy zone where defining what Iranian territorial waters are and what UAE territorial waters are and what Omani territorial waters are is not quite settled. So there's an expansion there that is made possible by the removal of American forces. And so this question of where does land and sea end and begin, this is precisely it. And I mean, this is what moorings is trying to do, but also there is something different about this kind of trade at sea, right? There's a kind of, I mean, these guys were caught because they were moving bulky, heavy consumer goods. With diesel, it's pipes thrown overboard, pipes taken off. It takes 4 seconds, the entire transaction, right? So there is a way in which the materiality of the thing itself makes a huge difference in thinking about what is possible at sea versus what is possible on land. And evasion, it means something different at sea than on land. Patrollers work differently, perhaps. So I think these questions around connected oceans and actually on jurisdiction and sovereignty are actually very much tied together, and perhaps an entry point.
When people ask 2 questions, you did this to Murari as well. You said they're actually the same question. Well done. But thank you for those very detailed and thoughtful answers. Tiju, I'm glad you've joined us. Is there something you would like to ask or say? If you're here. There you are.
Hi, I'm here. I'm so sorry, Nidhi, that but I did manage to log in and catch most of your talk. I'll watch the rest of it subsequently. I love the questions, especially Dilip's and Murari's and so on, which I think really opened up the scope of what you were trying to say and gave you the space in which to give them the answers you wanted to. I really enjoyed listening to this. But I've been in and out of elevators and not in the right frame of mind to ask any question. So once I've had the chance to watch this thing completely, maybe I will reconnect about this.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. And I just want to, at the end of the talk, welcome you on behalf of the Center for International Research.
Thank you.
Actually, that's
Thanks,
really
Dennis.
why I thought Teju should come on, since we are co-hosts on this. And I wonder, were there any more questions? Please raise your hand, make yourself visible, make a noise. If there are no more questions, then perhaps we should, we've got another 5 minutes to go. But if there are no more questions, then perhaps we could just thank Nidhi for that really lovely, expansive, detailed, textured paper, and the way in which you answered those questions so thoughtfully, because I think these are questions we are all mulling over as we think about the ocean, try and move away from writing merely terrestrial histories to thinking about these connected histories, as it were. And so thank you for being with us, and best of luck with your book, which I really look forward to reading, because I've heard you speak on so many occasions. You've contributed a paper to the volume that you've edited, and so the range of the work seems very large. So thank you, Nidhi. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And good to see you, Teju. Glad you could join us. So if there's nothing more, I'd like to say bye to all of you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for the invitation and for these great questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.